as we get this call started. You're in the right place, and here we are right on time. We're going to get started in a minute as people filter in for the Alaskan Way, breaking big money's grip, for a conversation all about how we working together can get big money out of politics with big foundational permanent change by way of a constitutional amendment. So thank you all for being here tonight. I see folks streaming in, and we're going to have plenty of time for questions, comments, discussion, and action all around getting money out of politics. And as we give folks a couple more seconds to stream in here, my name's Azer Cole, and we'll have more proper introductions in a second here. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Clements, president of American Promise, to kick us off. Hey, Jeff.
Hey, Azer, how are you? Thank you. Thank you, Azer. Thanks for everybody for being here. It's an important conversation. We've got some great guests we're going to introduce in just a few minutes. As Azer said, my name is Jeff Clements. I'm president of American Promise. We're a national, cross-partisan, nonpartisan organization uniting Americans to rebuild and renew our country, particularly focused on big reform around how money is used in our political system. We have members in Alaska, all over the country, from all parts of the political spectrum. And we've got some really good news and information to share with you tonight. It's a conversation that we're starting at our end. It's a conversation that's been going on in Alaska and across the country for some time, but we are looking to support and help unite Alaskans for the work in Alaska to move this constitutional amendment forward. And we'll share more about that at the end of our call. You heard from Azer Cole. He's our Deputy National Political Director at American Promise, and he'll be talking more about our polling and survey data from Alaska that we want to share. And of course, you'll be hearing from our special guests, who I'm going to introduce from Alaskans for Better Elections, and that's Shay over there, and I'll let you give him a better, more formal introduction in just a minute, and Judy from the Alaskan League of Women Voters. But before I do, I just want to acknowledge, and I see some friends coming on the call, Sharman Haley, and I think Chief Justice Bud Carpenetti is going to be joining us, and others in the webinar. And as Azer said, please share your questions or comments in the Q&A, and we'll try to bring those into the conversation. But I was in Alaska last year. Got glad to call so many people in Juneau now, Fairbanks, Anchorage, Talkeetna, around the state, who were so hospitable as I and my wife visited and spoke and talked with people, Alaskans in all of those places, about this problem of money in politics, as we do in all states across the country. And at that time, 2019 seems a different world, doesn't it? But a lot of the same problems around our elections were going on. Alaska's anti-corruption laws with reasonable limits on election contributions had been upheld by Judge Tim Burgess there in Anchorage in Alaska, and struck down in Washington by the courts. APOC, Alaska Public Offices Commission, was in court saying, we'd love to defend our Alaska laws, but we can't because of the federal laws, saying the courts, which we think are kind of activist, striking down state laws, saying all this money pouring into the elections is just free speech. And most Americans don't agree. We know that free speech is not helped by billions of dollars of outside money from a few big donors, while most Americans are not being heard and not represented well. And so that's why I think I found support in Alaska, and I know you did too, as you talked to your friends and colleagues there about this problem. And we're back to share not only the polling in Alaska, but since then, a lot of good things have happened. More states, we're now at 22 states, have formally called for a constitutional amendment, a federal amendment to have limits and allow the states like Alaska to have real effective rules that address the money. Of course, we're going to hear more from Alaskans for Better Elections, one ballot measure 2, with a great deal of significant reforms, including disclosure laws that are going to be very promising for showing where some of this money is coming from. But we've also had a record election in terms of cost of money and massive amounts of disinformation spent on all sides by toxic attack ads. $15 billion in the 2020 race nationally. Almost all the money coming from a donor class of less than 1%. Despite the more small dollar donors, it's still mostly big money. And in Alaska too, a record $67 million in the 27 election in Alaska compared to 10 million just 4 years ago in 2016. Most of these big dollar donations, 67 million, coming from the same small group of national donors, 85% from outside Alaska, most of it spent on toxic, misleading ads and things that divide us, tear us apart, and do not provide the kind of information we want us to actually govern ourselves in our states and across this country. So we're going to tackle this. We're going to start with our conversation with these two wonderful people and wonderful organizations. Judy Andrew, president of the League of Women Voters of Alaska. Judy, thank you for being here. Shay Seeger, from now interim executive director at Alaskans for Better Elections, who pulled off that enormous reform victory in this ballot question 2 this past year. Shay, thank you for being here with us as well. We're just going to turn it over to Azer first to get everybody on the call on the same page with some of this information. And then we're going to be back to talk with both of you about your work in Alaska and how we move forward. And at the end, everyone, we're going to invite you. It's intentionally a small group of people, as we do in all of the states, because we're interested in sharing this opportunity to begin building this with Alaskans. And so we'll ask you to join us if this sounds like something you want to do, and to bring your networks and friends and introduce them to this effort, this wonderful cross-partisan, hopeful effort. So you've heard me say it's cross-partisan. You've heard me say it's supermajority support. Now we're going to show you. Azer, Cole, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Shay and Judy, and everyone for tuning in here. I'm going to share my screen in just a second to really drive home a point that I think is easy to forget if you're not cued into reform polling, which normal people are not cued into reform polling, and normal people watch the news and read the newspapers and consume media and see a country divided. But I'm going to share my screen here and talk a little bit about, one reason to be quite optimistic, to really the opportunity in front of us, which is that when it comes to big foundational solutions to our big money problem, our inability to limit in reasonable, common sense ways money spent in our elections through things like independent expenditures, super PACs from, who knows where, we don't know for the most part, and we can't control their spending in any meaningful way. When it comes to supporting a constitutional amendment to fix this problem foundationally and allow for reasonable limits on political spending nationally, for years now, there's been poll after poll showing 60, 70, 80% across the political spectrum supporting this amendment. But we've just recently received Alaska-specific polling, which in really exciting fashion confirms that this is not some national trend that doesn't carry forward in Alaska, but in fact it not only carries forward, but it is really powerful in its recency and consistency in showing that 71% of Alaskan voters support this specific amendment to allow reasonable limits on political spending. 16% oppose, and 13% are neutral. And there's big opportunity to productively engage those undecided voters. So we think over 4 times as many Alaskan voters support this than they do oppose it. Well, that's a big opportunity. And when we look at these numbers a little bit more specifically, we see that this really is not a partisan issue, that this is something that we can work together on. And among Alaskans, 19% of Republicans are opposed. 1% of Democrats are opposed. 15% of independents are opposed. You can see among Republicans, there's a large percentage of people, 26%, who are still undecided. That's a huge group, and we're going to be talking about some effective ways to talk about this amendment and the problem of money in politics and this constitutional solution in a second. 7% of Democrats are undecided, 11% of independents are undecided. And then when you get to the supporting numbers, 55% of Republicans, 92% of Democrats, 72% of independents. It really cuts across the board to varying degrees, but all majorities, no matter which way you slice it. I don't have a visual for this particular graphic, but when you look even more detailed at the demographics of Alaskans polled, it's quite consistent, with 70% of men and 72% of women supporting this amendment, 69% of people aged 18 to 34, 65% ages between 35 and 54, 68% between 54 and 64, and folks over 65 supporting this at a 78% clip. It's wildly consistent, which is reason for big optimism. And when we think, okay, well, how do we convince those undecided? And how do we move those who might actively oppose this to be more undecided or on the fence of supporting this? Well, one of the most powerful ways that we found through experience and now through scientific polling to talk about this is when given this framing of the problem that reasonable limits on campaign contributions would give less power to out-of-state interests and more power to Alaskans in our elections, voters were 72% more likely to support this amendment. 13% were less likely, and 15% were undecided. We talk about just the inability of states to set meaningful, strong state laws that reasonably limit money spent in their own state's elections. That's something that really fires people up across the political spectrum and is resonant and motivating for, most all Americans that we've engaged with on this, but unsurprising in, a relatively small population state like Alaska, where, the presence of 10 mailers on your doorstep might be felt more than in a state like California, where there's just so many more people for the dark money to try to have an impact on. So that's the final point I want to close on here, that this, very real impact on small population states in particular that disproportionately feel the impacts of out-of-state money that we're currently unable to set reasonable limits on. This is going to be an effective framing of the problem and framing of why we need this foundational solution. So I'll end there, and please, as we're going throughout this conversation and you're thinking of questions, do use the Q&A feature that's in the bottom center of your screen. But I'm going to kick it back to Jeff to guide us in conversation with our guest speakers here, Judy and Shay. So Jeff, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and kick it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Azer, for sharing that. And there's more if anybody wants to dive into the details on the polling. We'll be happy to provide a copy of the details after the call. Thanks for sharing that. And of course, it's not just the money in the abstract. People don't care necessarily about like a number, money. It's the problem is, of course, people everywhere are feeling like our voices aren't being heard, our problems aren't being solved, we're being torn apart and ungovernable as a country, and losing our ability to control our destiny, control our states, control our communities and lives in a way that we were, of course, understandably led to expect in a republic form of government that this would not be the case. So this is real, very real from every issue and every person, and we have a big chance to fix it. And the wonderful reaction we get in everywhere we go in the different states when people see this is almost relief that, oh, everybody's, a lot of people anyway, most people are thinking like I do. That gives me hope, because now we can work together and we're not as divided as we're told. So Judy and Shay, let me start with this polling, and then we're going to dive into your work in Alaska, specifically at the League and Alaskans for Better Elections and what you're doing. But first, let me ask you, let's start with Judy. What do these numbers tell you? This is Alaskans data. Does this ring true to what you hear when you talk to Alaskans, what you see there, and what does it say about what we can do going forward?
Well, I think that the 72% pro change is pretty accurate myself from what we've seen. And I think also from the work we did with Shay on the ballot measure number 2, where the disclosure is so important. And I just, speaking for the League has an interest also in doing something about money in politics. And they're looking at both quicker things to do and also they're open to an amendment kind of an approach. I think it actually is going to take both and some other changes too before we have a completely, I don't know, I don't want to say money free, but I'm controlled money spending. And it's almost a moral issue when you think of the money pouring into campaigns every other year now, as opposed to the moral issue of taking care of your citizens. There's a lot of money going to win an election, probably more so than it goes to help people, right? Particularly during the pandemic. And that's on the top of, I think, everybody's list. So, but I don't want to talk too long right now, but I do want to talk later about the For the People Act, which has some money and politics issues, as well as some rights and that kind of thing. But
great. Well, we'll circle back to that, Judy. And I just want to get Shay's read and take on the poll number too, but then we'll dive in deep, because you're right. There's not one answer that's going to fix everything. It's really going to take a lot. And it's going to take all of us working together to get a lot done. And I think nothing is really too big, or nobody can predict what's short term, what's long term. And that's why we're pretty excited about the chance to lock into the Constitution for all time some of these ability to secure our political system against this kind of destabilizing money, as well as all the other things. And we're going to hear more about the For the People Act from Judy in just a minute. But Shay, let me ask you, you are a student and a practitioner of politics and reform and help lead the ballot initiative. You don't waste anything like needing to get 75%. You don't get a vote more than you need. We had a very close and hard fought, big win with one of the most comprehensive reforms I've seen on a ballot anywhere in the country. And kudos to you and to Alaskans for diving into the details and saying, yeah, this has got some really good things. And if I don't love everything, I know we got to go big. That's what it seemed to us. But tell us, what did you see, and what do you see in these numbers? And then we'll talk more about the specifics of number 2 and Alaskans for Better Elections.
Well, that's and you said something important there, Jeff, and I really appreciate and I'm honored to be on this call. Thank you so much, and seeing some familiar names here on the roll sheet here. It's great to see everyone tuning in. But you said something really important there. It was about the voters. It always was, always is about the voters and what the voters of Alaska want. In ballot measure 2, one important pillar of what the voters wanted was more disclosure, more information about who's donating, who's paying for the 8 mailers we were getting per day, at least here in Anchorage, probably more down in Juneau, and more elsewhere across the state. You know, it was about providing voters with the power of knowledge and who is paying for these this inundation of political advertisements. And so when I see numbers like the ones that you provided on your poll with 71%, it's a no-brainer. No wonder, everywhere you talk, everyone you talk to across the state and across the country, you ask them, is there too much money in politics? They say, well, yeah, there is, way too much. And this is, I think we showed that with ballot measure 2. I think one big fight that's coming is implementation, making sure that what we passed at the ballot box is what goes into the regulations for our Alaska Public Offices Commission, and that the commission has the staff needed to implement these things, to make sure that folks are following them, and that Alaskans know what's coming in terms of these reforms, and specifically the dark money provisions.
Yeah. We had some reform on some other ballots that did not succeed as well. This can be complicated stuff because we have big problems and we need innovation, and there's really interesting and powerful innovations like open primaries and ranked choice voting and some of the things you brought forward for Alaskans to consider. And it was just so impressive how grassroots your campaign was, and how Alaskans were sharing information, learning from each other, debating, and ultimately deciding, yeah, we need to take on the really broken structural things. So can you try to sort of draw a bit of the lines connecting these? They're all different reforms, but American Promise, we were proud to be a small part of it, on the money in politics, and Alaskans in the law now as calls for this constitutional amendment we're talking about. But we also loved seeing the connections of people made between, like, how the party primaries go make us divisive and lock out most of the voters, or how the divisiveness of multi-candidate races could mean like somebody could win with 30%, like they did in Maine, of the vote. There's just a lot of things broken, and you guys fixed an awful lot, which is just so impressive. And when I say you guys, like you said, Alaskan voters, tell us a little more, connect some of these pieces, how it'll work, what you're seeing in the state, and then bring it back to the money and the next step, which we hope to help Alaskans get together on and lock some big reform like this into the Constitution for all time.
Yeah, so I think the common denominator is answering the question, what's going to give the voters the most voice, choice, and power. I mean, I said that thousands of times on the campaign, and as well as our team did, as well as Alaskans did when they voted and passed ballot measure 2. And so, the common denominator is the power that voters have to change the system the way they want it, to change the incentives of politicians and folks in DC or Juneau or state capitals across the country to focus on truly representing their constituency, not a political special interest, not a big money donor, not a political party, but at the end of the day, being truly representative of the folks that they elect them, but also that they represent. And so I would say the main common denominator is the voters and the power, and bringing power back to the voters. One thing that's maybe jumping out of order here, but one thing that's really important to note about ballot measure 2 as we go kind of next steps, the results of the election were certified on November 30th. So 90 days after November 30th, the law is codified and in effect. So here in Anchorage, we're going to see a mayoral race. The dark money provision affects that mayoral race, but in our ballot measure 2, we did not affect municipal races. So you're not going to see ranked choice voting. We don't have a primary for mayoral elections, so you're not going to see an open primary, obviously. But we only affected state elections, all the way up to from president down to state house and state senate. And so wanted to make sure to get that clarification out there, because we've been getting a lot of questions on the ground about that. And want to toss it over to Judy to see what she sees as the link between all of these, as well as the League of Women Voters. You know, the League is the cornerstone of bringing power back to voters for so many years.
Yeah, great, thanks. And Judy, that is your cue, if I ever heard it, to jump in and share what you're doing and what your priorities are, and connect up some of this work.
Well, as I said earlier, the League supports both short things that should take a shorter amount of time to fix some of the problems with money in politics, but also looking ahead to an amendment. So that anything that works is our motto, I think, for this one. I was just looking at the For the People Act, which was just recently reintroduced in the House, the US House. It was there before, it went to the Senate and it sat there, but now there's maybe a chance that it'll get through. One of the provisions in the money and politics part of that is called small donor public campaign financing. And I think it goes hand in hand with ranked choice voting. See if my thinking on this is not too crazy, but in small donor public campaign financing, any candidate who shows a serious effort to run or campaign, meaning they have enough small donor donations already, will qualify. And it depends on where you're, what those qualifications are. I know New York City has used this for quite some time, and they're trying to expand that to the whole state of New York. But those folks then are getting a 6-to-1 return on the small campaign donations, and they can still go ahead and raise money from other places. But what this does is gives more voters sort of a buy-in ability into a campaign, and it forces the candidate to campaign to all the constituents, all the possible constituents. And that means, as ranked choice voting, I hope people figure out, means it will draw candidates towards more people, more voters. And that means they have to go a little bit back towards the middle if they've already gotten out on the fringes of either side of the spectrum. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with closed primaries, which Shay talked about, and also big donations where we don't know where they're coming from. And I took a look at APOC at one campaign that we had in November, one election result that we had in November. And it was interesting because the incumbent lost the election, and in one reporting had 46 donations, and only 15 of them were $100 or less. And the winning candidate had, during that same period, had 346 donations, with 160 of them being small donations. So I think that was sort of an instructive look at how small donations can actually be successful. And those weren't matched in this election, but they would be matched if HR 1 passes. So I think that's something to look at. If you're in Alaska now, you can actually contact Representative Young and encourage him to vote for it when it comes up for a vote, if you're into that sort of thing. But I think that's one of the strongest money issues in there. And they're also going to revamp the FEC, because right now it's sort of at a standstill, and it's not even fully, the number of commissioners hasn't been filled. So they'll have a 5-member commission, and there'll be the 5th person will be the tiebreaker, but 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, I guess, and then an independent, which hopefully gets paid more for being in that position. But so that's another thing that might help. And also are ballot measure number 2, the dark money. There's provisions in there to make better transparency, particularly for online ads, which apparently aren't covered by current law. So those will be included, and some of the big social media platforms will have to actually keep a database that the public can see about who's asked to run a campaign, a political ad, and the money that they're taking in on that. So those are reforms that if we could pass this bill, those would go into effect immediately while we work towards an amendment. And it's something that the league is really pushing right now. So
Yeah, that's great, Judy. Thank you. And there is a piece of the For the People Act, which actually includes a resolution saying that Congress needs to vote on the amendment and get the states to ratify it. So it's all connected, as you say. And I just want to lay out constitutional amendments. We've done 27 of them. All of them, and the big things: Bill of Rights, women voting, term limits for presidents, lots of big reforms that and we did 4 of them between 1961 and 1971. So this is not something that we're the first generation to have to figure out how to do. They've all gone 2/3 of Congress vote, ratification by 3/4 of the states. And so the reason we wanted to share these polls is because, we would love, of course, to see Dan Sullivan and Lisa Murkowski and Don Young get behind this. In Washington, in Congress, like a lot of things in Congress, they're not really listening as well to the people. They don't realize, I think, how much there's a unified support for this: Republicans, Democrats, Independents. And I want to ask you both, frankly, your advice. If we unite Alaskans, and who are the people who aren't in this conversation, or who were in the conversations you're having but maybe don't know about the constitutional amendment, who Don Young and Lisa Murkowski, Dan Sullivan are going to listen to and think, wow, that's a new perspective. I didn't realize Alaskans like that actually want an amendment too. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I think perhaps from what I've read lately, that Lisa Murkowski would be the one to approach, and you'd most likely get a hearing that way. I've noticed some shifting. There have been several articles, and Shay's aware of these, where ranked choice voting has taken some pressure off of her to adhere to a far right point of view, since she's in that particular party. So I would suggest starting with her, and then I'll let Shay.
Yeah, let me ask Shay, like, and if you work, I think in Azer, maybe you could dig up the Jim Rubens is on our board. He's a Republican from New Hampshire. Dealt with a lot. He ran for the U.S. Senate in 2016 in a $130 million Senate race, almost all the money from outside New Hampshire. Became a convert to this cause, joined our board. And Azer, maybe you could put up his points about federalism and the impacts on business. And we've got business people all over the country joining our effort now. And I wonder, is that a strategy that works in Alaska, to bring the business people into the conversation? Bring, Shay, you did it a lot on the ballot measure too, to bring people together. What did you find works for that?
I think it's all of the above. I'm a little bit of a broken record on the voters. It's mobilizing folks to call their senators, but also getting people over essentially a viability hump. We've for years watched different things happen at our state legislature, our national legislature, that we may agree with. Some things, a lot of things we don't agree with, gauging by polling numbers on public approval of the legislature. Probably a lot of things we disagree with. But the fact of the matter is we may have public approval in the single digits or maybe the teens, but we have a retention rate that's in the 90% of all legislators elected. We also have a strong voter class in Alaska. We have people of all walks of life saying enough is enough. That's what was shown on ballot measure 2. We got huge support from rural Alaska. Rural Alaska said quite definitively said enough is enough, and said this is our state, this is our reform. We're going to change things for the better, and they did it. And we won the entire coastline of the state on ballot measure 2, and that was fantastic to see. So I really think in a state like Alaska, it's a state where you really pick, not to use the old adage, but pick yourself up by your bootstraps and change things for yourself. And so mobilizing the voters to make the calls, but also putting the information in front of them like you have with your polling, as to, it's something that you can go to your neighbor and you don't have to ask them what party they're a part of, but you can ask them, is there too much money in politics? And 71% of your neighbors will agree.
Yeah. And the others are ready to have a conversation about it and maybe come around as well. Let me ask you, Shay, while I have you, and Judy will bring you back in too, but there's some questions coming in, and do type your questions either in the Q&A or throw them in the chat. And there's a few just wanting an update on the challenges, whether legal or in the legislature. Obviously, I think people want to see this implemented and are excited about it, but what are any hurdles that people should know about in terms of legal or legislative challenges?
Yeah. So right now, on the lawsuit front, the Alaskans for Better Elections filed a motion to intervene. So when the lawsuit got brought up, the defendant of the policies is the state administration and the Department of Law, who has some great attorneys working in around the clock to do the legal work on behalf of the state. We filed a motion to intervene, to assist, and take up that case to defend ballot measure 2 and the will of the voters in the courts. And we feel pretty confident going into this lawsuit that we will reign victorious in the end, knock on wood. But right now it's in the courts, and we haven't had our first hearing on it yet, but I'm sure it's coming. In the legislature, the legislature has 2 years until they can repeal it by our Constitution. The will of the voters is very, very protected in our Constitution, and we'll see is the thing. One body of the legislature is not organized. Our House is not organized. We're hoping for folks to work together over there and organize and move the state forward, because they have a lot of tough questions to answer. But right now we're keeping an eye on things. We want to make sure that the funding goes to the Alaska Public Offices Commission to fund the 2 positions that go towards implementing the dark money pieces. We want to make sure that any regulations that come with implementation are in good faith and make sure that they do the right things. We had a team of Alaskans draft the initiative, and so those are the same Alaskans that are going to be helping implement it and defend it. And really the third portion of it is making sure that for everyone on this call that your legislator is upholding your will in their work, making sure that they are not trying to undermine the will of the voters in doing anything that's malicious to the intent of ballot measure 2 in our dark money provisions, our open primaries, and our ranked choice voting in the general.
Oh, great. Thanks for that update. And of course, I think not only Alaskans, but people around the country are rooting for the implementation. And we've here in New England certainly seen it make a big impact in Maine, and know it was a hard fought effort to implement. So winning these things is the beginning. And of course, it's a lot of the work we're all involved in, I think, is reinvigorating and inspiring the citizenry to stay on this day after day, because that's what it takes. So big thanks to you. Judy, any closing thoughts from your end before I want to open it up to a few more questions, but anything else you want to add either on the situation in Alaska, the League, its constitutional amendment effort, and or in Washington?
Well, as I was looking at some of these bills and thinking about some of the other bills that the League is also interested in, it occurred to me that they're all very interrelated. When we talk about small donor public campaign financing, but we have people who either don't get equal pay, which the ERA would take care of. So that's really part of this. And or who aren't allowed to vote because their rights have been suppressed. They are less likely to be interested in any of this that's going on. So there are just, I guess, a multiple number of fronts that we have to be aware of are interrelated and continue to work on all of those things. And I think that, if money can be regulated in a way that allows more people to feel they have a say in what goes on, and obviously they don't like what's going on right now, at least from the data from Alaska, that it's going to increase turnout, it's going to increase willingness to be an educated voter. And I think it's just very critical to the continuation of our democracy to get this fixed. So.
Yeah, well, thank you. As well said. And I'm going to shamelessly steal Shay's line, which sums it up as voice, choice, and power for voters. Voice, choice, power. It's what this is all about. There'll be plenty of money from the voters who live there and are the ones who should be spending the time conversations with elected officials with good small dollar incentives. And there's lots of ways to do small dollar systems and people want to participate that way. But if we can get some limits around, the $100 million donors and the $10 million donors and say, look, you have a voice too, just like everybody else, just don't drown out your fellow citizens, we'll be in a much better place. So thank you both so much. I do see a couple of people I see Robert Dillon on the call, who also did some work around Alaskans for Better Elections, formerly worked with Lisa Murkowski, who came up here. And I wonder, Azer, maybe we could just give Robert the line for a minute, because I'd love to ask him the same question I asked Shay and Judy, given his experience. We have 55%, a good number of Republicans. In other states, we've seen it well over 70. And I think the difference is that big 20% who are kind of wondering, like, what is this about? Is this okay for Republicans to be on board? And they'll get there with more information. But Robert, let me ask you, thank you for jumping on with like that. But would you share any strategies or ideas or thoughts you have on turning that 20% undecided of Alaskan Republicans into big yeses, like their fellow GOP members around the country?
I think you have to change the incentives around politics and give politicians different incentives to, be public servants instead of, just focused on getting power. And so that kind of changes to the system, which ranked choice voting and, eliminating the dark money and the open primaries is aimed at doing. I think once you see that the game can change and that they can still win elections, that they'll come around to reform.
Yeah. Well, here. And thanks for all you do. I know how much you do in the reform space as well. And it's been a pleasure to work with you as well, Robert. Azer, did you have a question for Dylan before? I also want to jump and see if we can bring in Rebecca Braun down in Juneau with a question about independence as well, a key piece. But
yeah, let's bring in Rebecca here. Thank you, Robert, for sharing. And I do want to focus on independence in a state with so many independent voters. It's really a key group to really focus in on.
Great. Rebecca, hello. I hope you can hear me. Good to be with you. Thanks for jumping on.
Hi, I can hear you. Thanks.
Good, good. Independents, I know in Alaska are one of the fastest growing groups of voters. It's true here in New England too. It's true around the country, I think, as people are just finding the party system has become so toxic and divisive and frustrating that people are really looking for that independent voice. And I wanted to ask you, a number like 72% or so of independents supporting this kind of jumps off the page. What can you tell us about that? How do you read that? What's the situation with independents in Alaska on that one?
Well, thanks. I think a few things. I mean, one, that number is growing, and it's very, very high. And I think it reflects Alaskans for a few things. One is we don't often, some of our issues don't really cut across the traditional Republican, Democrat lines nationally. We really have some unique issues and unique demographics, unique economics. And so I think that's one reason we have such a high number of independents and people, it's growing. And I think it's a reflection of frustration with institutions in a lot of ways. And this is something happening nationally, that trust is going down in virtually all institutions. And I think that includes political parties. And so I think, at the same time, people's faith in democracy is going down and partisan rancor is going up. And that's one reason I think there's so much appetite for change right now. I think people really are unhappy with the status quo, and that's another thing that the rising number of independents shows. And I think that this kind of change is really needed, similar to ballot measure 2. I think it'll help address all these problems and help restore a sense of ownership and in our government, and a sense of agency that people are kind of lacking. And another thought I have is, I think that when there's so much disagreement about policy issues, a really good way forward is to focus on improving the process. I think that that's the way I see this, as really a process improvement. And maybe if we can improve the process, we can start to get some more constructive dialogue on the policy issues that divide us.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think that's absolutely right. I wanted to pull a question in, which is, of course, the question that we have to take seriously when talking about a constitutional amendment, which is really, can this really happen? Amendments are really, really hard. The last one was actually ratified in the mid-90s, believe it or not, but that's a bit of a side story. It kicked around for many, many, many years before being ratified. But 1971, 18, 19, 20-year-olds got the right to vote. They've been drafted into the armed services with no right to vote. That had been 40 years in the making. Went back to World War II in an efforts to get it then and happen then. But, here's what's interesting about that. That was the fourth of 4 constitutional amendments in 10 years. Some DC residents got some representation. There was a significant amendment to end the poll tax, which had been used to keep voters from voting. 30, 40 years before that, 4 more amendments, women getting the right to vote, election of senators, things like big things. And so, these things come in cycles. What's interesting about when they happen is it's sort of, all of our guests alluded to, voters are exasperated. This is falling apart and it's dangerously destabilized. That's what the 60s were like, political assassination, burning cities. It was a tough time, but we did those big things. And I think that's what we're seeing now. So what makes us think it could happen? Why do we do this? Is because of not only the will of Americans we talk to and we see everywhere we go, but they're turning it into action. So we had our ballot initiative here in Massachusetts, 1,000 volunteers, grassroots effort to put the amendment on the ballot, won 72%. Republicans, Democrats, Independents created a citizen commission to move it forward. Montana did that, Colorado did that, many other states. There's now over 200 House members and 50 senators on board. That's closing in within striking range of passage out of the Congress. And this effort's been 40 years in the making. A lot of a lot of efforts to get money out of politics started well before it was as bad as it is now. And now every American knows how bad it is. And you're really starting to see the tipping point of the kinds that happen when things that seemed impossible become inevitable. And I think that's what we're seeing. Who heard of ranked choice voting, 10 years ago? And now it's really sweeping the country in a lot of ways. So I think that's similar to the ballot initiative itself 100 years ago. Americans innovate when we get realize that that's what it's really going to take. So we're seeing the strategy, we're seeing the alignment, we're seeing some of the essential things you need: cross-partisan support, ubiquity across, not just the political types, but the civic and the business and the outdoors and the faith. And, Judy called it a moral issue. We're seeing the kind of moments where Americans do big, big things and reestablish the possibility of self-government again for another generation or two before they'll have to do something like this again. So that's what keeps us going. And everywhere we go, we get validation to say, it would be historical malpractice if we don't do this, because Americans are so ready to do this. So let's get it done. And to help get it done, we need Alaska. We need your senators. They're not there yet, but they haven't said no. And we think there's a lot of ways to get Republicans in the Congress to begin working, not necessarily to jump on the same resolution that has 50 Democrats and independents already signed on, but to plant a flag of their own about this. And we think to do that, we need Alaskans to lead the way, not just go on a lobby effort, but really show Alaska's elected representatives that Alaskans want them to do this. So thank you so much, Judy. Thank you, Shay. Thank you, Robert, Rebecca, and everybody on this call. I want to turn it back to Azer to just share what the next step is. All right. Maybe some are going to say, well, this is too big, it's not going to happen. But if you're like so many people, you're ready to give it a try. Azer is going to share some ideas, and when we want to listen and learn from you. So most of the next steps are tell us what you need to be effective in Alaska that we can help with. So Azer, take it from here and close it out.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. And to all of our speakers, for eloquently articulating the problem, talking about some of the many different ways to win this big foundational solution. And now we'll get specific. There's an enormous opportunity in front of us now. And frankly, we've seen the polling, the consensus is there. It's about rolling up our sleeves and turning that statistical consensus into real world action among a diverse assemblage of Alaskans. And that's what American Promise does across the country. We support state chapters, and these are networks of people working in their home communities, collaborating with others across the state, and I should say the country. It's a supportive national network of Americans driving this forward to victory. And Alaska is just, no matter which way you look at it, one of the most critical states in this national effort for a constitutional amendment. And this is why we're working to support a state chapter focused on building and holding the political power that we need to see this through. So I'm going to share my screen here again, just to give a sense of another small state with a small population. I shouldn't say small state, but a state with a small population that's independently minded, that our state chapter has been doing quite effective, exciting work that I don't anticipate Alaskans to do the exact same thing, but I do want to share to give a sense of some of the really good work that's being done in the country. So I'm going to share my screen here. And we're talking about Maine here. And the Maine American Promise chapter launched a campaign called Stand With Maine. And I'm just going to slowly scroll as I talk here. The goal of this campaign of the Maine American Promise chapter is to get their state ready to ratify this constitutional amendment. And, when I say ready to ratify, what exactly do I mean? Well, I mean that Mainers have taken on the challenge of creating the sustained conditions in their state's political, social, civic, and media culture to reflect support for this constitutional amendment. And in doing so, winning the support of a majority of their congressional delegation and state legislators. When we think of amendments, we need congressional support and we need support in the state legislature. But, are we going to get it simply by meeting with our member of Congress once or twice and meeting with our state representatives 3 or 4 times? It might take a little bit more strategic work than that. And, what we're supporting groups in across the country, and again, this is just Maine as an example, is getting really good and effective at talking with small businesses, for example, and making the connection between how money and politics really creates an uneven playing field, which disproportionately squeezes out the little guys. And that's why LT's Embroidery in Maine, for example, or DeFore Tax Group actively supports our efforts. So when we go into that meeting with Senator Collins, for example, all of a sudden we're telling her something that she hasn't quite heard before when she's thinking about this constitutional amendment, and they're making progress. That's just one of the different avenues. Supporting groups in talking about this from a conservation perspective. The biggest conservation group, one of the most right-leaning advocacy groups in the state of Maine, the Maine Sportsmen's Alliance, has endorsed our efforts because they hate money in politics. They hate people coming in from out of state telling them how to, regulate their bear hunting and telling them what they can and can't do out in the beautiful Maine wilderness. All of these strategic framing of the problem of money in politics, talking about outside money, making it impossible to have strong local governance, really putting an emphasis on network building with business worlds, conservation worlds, legal worlds, college students, fisheries, native voices, you name it, lifting up the voices of everyday people, right, left, and center, and telling those stories and making this truly be not such an intellectual, wonky campaign finance issue, but one that is an issue that's affecting everyday Mainers in this case, more importantly, Alaskans in our case. This is the work that folks are doing in American Promise chapters across the country. It's the work we're committed to supporting in Alaska. And this is a small enough group that I'm committed to doing some individual outreach for those interested. Please do raise your hand right now, just on the right side of your screen, if you want me to follow up with you early on in this process to learn more about this chapter work that we're supporting. I'll also plot my email in the chat here, but there's a big opportunity in Alaska, and I just wanted to take those couple minutes to share one vision for something similar that this could look like. I see some folks raising their hand here, which is fantastic. And before we hit the hour here, Jeff, I'll turn it back to you and our guests for the last word.
Great. Well, thank you, Azer. And I'm going to put it a little differently. Raise your hand if you don't want us to follow up, because you're going to hear from us. And but seriously, give Azer's put his email in. Shoot an email if you want to help. But we will follow up because we said we would, to share the poll link, so you guys can have the poll and use it as you wish. Some of the slides that Azer shared on this call. But we would love to be introduced even to people who you think we should be talking to, who maybe weren't on this call, who might be interested in helping out and building. It might not be Stand with Alaskans. It might be something else. We support and listen to what the folks in the state want to do, and then help build out platforms and networks, and bring what we can to help sort of accelerate it and align it with all the other states, so that we do actually make this not only viable, but passed and ratified in the next several years. So that's the goal. We will follow up, but do reach out to us. We want to unite every sector of American life, and we don't care what your politics are. This is one thing we can all agree on. Huge thanks to Judy. Huge thanks to Shay, Robert, Rebecca. Congratulations to everyone in Alaska. leading the country on some big, big reforms and inspiring all of us. And again, thanks to everybody on the call. Have a great night, and we'll hope to talk to you again soon. Take care now.
Great. Thanks.
Daisy, do you want to unmic and let people say goodbye? So bye, everybody.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Azer and everyone, and Judy, of course. Thanks everyone for being on. It was a great conversation tonight, and looking forward to doing more of these in the future.
Great. Thanks, Shay.
Great. Thanks, you guys.